The influence of African cultures on colonial music. Imagine standing in a bustling colonial port city centuries ago. Ships from Europe dock at the harbor, bringing not only goods and soldiers, but also carrying with them the rigid sounds of European instruments and musical traditions. Yet, as they step onto African soil, they encounter something far more vibrant: drums that echo like thunder, rhythms that speak to the heartbeat of the earth, and songs woven with stories of ancestors, survival, and hope. This meeting of worlds did not simply create noise, it created a new language. The rich tapestry of African cultures, with their powerful rhythms and soulful melodies, began to seep into the very fabric of colonial music. And in this blending, something extraordinary was born. African drums merged with European violins, chants intertwined with hymns, and call and response patterns reshaped the way music was performed and shared. Out of this fusion came entirely new genres, alive with energy and layered with meaning. These sounds became more than entertainment, they were vessels of resistance, carriers of identity, and storytellers for communities under colonial rule. But it wasn't only the colonized who felt this transformation. Even the colonizers themselves could not resist the pull of these rhythms. European musical traditions, once rigid and confined, began to bend, adapt, and evolve under the influence of African culture. The result? A musical landscape unlike anything the world had known, rich, complex, and deeply human. It was music born from struggle, yet infused with resilience. It was heritage refusing to be silenced, echoing across generations, and shaping the music we still hear today. Picture for a moment the soundscape of the colonial world. It was not just the clash of armies or the chatter of markets that filled the air, it was music. And at the heart of this music lay a powerful story of encounter, adaptation, and transformation. The influence of African cultures on colonial music was not a single event, but a living process, unfolding across continents and centuries. It was born in the spaces where cultures collided, on plantations, in marketplaces, in churches, and on the very streets where communities struggled to survive and to express themselves. African musical traditions, rich with rhythm, call and response patterns, improvisation, and percussive energy, carried far more than entertainment. They carried history, identity, and memory. When these traditions met the structured harmonies and instruments of European colonizers, something new emerged. The fusion was not simple, it was layered, complex, and deeply human. From these encounters grew vibrant musical forms that reshaped entire regions. In the Americas and the Caribbean, African rhythms infused European folk songs and church hymns, giving birth to genres that still define music today: jazz, blues, samba, calypso, and beyond. Each beat, each melody, became a record of survival and a testament to cultural resilience. This exploration, then, is not just about music, it is about history told through sound. We will journey through the historical background, uncover the core characteristics of African music, and see how these powerful elements were woven into the colonial soundscape. And in doing so, we will understand how music became both a weapon of resistance and a bridge between worlds. To truly understand the impact of African cultures on colonial music, we must first step back into one of the darkest chapters of human history, the transatlantic slave trade. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, millions of Africans were torn from their homelands, shackled in chains, and forced across the Atlantic Ocean. They arrived in the Americas not as free individuals, but as enslaved people, condemned to backbreaking labor and brutal living conditions. Yet, even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, they carried with them something no ship could confiscate: their traditions, their stories, and their music. Music became more than sound. It became survival. In the fields, enslaved Africans used rhythm to coordinate their work. In hidden gatherings, they sang songs of hope, sorrow, and resistance. Their drums, chants, and melodies were more than expressions of art, they were languages of communication and acts of defiance against a system that tried to silence them. Over time, these African traditions collided with European instruments, harmonies, and musical forms. And from this fusion, something entirely new was born. Genres like jazz, blues, reggae, gospel, and countless folk traditions sprang to life, each carrying within them the heartbeat of Africa and the imprint of colonial influence. This history reminds us that music is not just entertainment, it is a record of resilience. The rhythms and melodies that echo through today's genres are living testaments to how culture can endure, adapt, and transform even in the face of oppression. Understanding this historical background is not just about appreciating music, it's about recognizing the courage, creativity, and humanity of those who, even in chains, found a way to make their voices heard. To truly appreciate the influence of African cultures on colonial music, we must first understand the heartbeat of African music itself, its defining characteristics that made it unlike anything Europe had ever known. At the very core lies rhythm. African music is rhythm-driven, layered with complex patterns and polyrhythms that seem to echo the heartbeat of life itself. Imagine not just one steady beat, but multiple rhythms weaving together like threads in a vibrant tapestry. This emphasis on rhythm would later become one of Africa's most powerful gifts to the music of the colonial world. Another defining feature is call and response. Picture a village gathering where a leader sings out a line, and the community answers back in unison. It's more than music, it's dialogue, a living conversation set to melody. This structure fostered connection, unity, and participation, and when carried into colonial settings, it transformed church hymns, work songs, and eventually gave rise to spirituals and gospel traditions. Improvisation is yet another hallmark of African music. Unlike the rigid structures of European compositions, African musicians embraced freedom within the music. Each performance could be unique, a reflection of personal emotion and creativity. This spirit of improvisation would one day breathe life into jazz, blues, and countless other genres that thrive on spontaneity. And then, of course, there are the instruments. From the thunderous gem drum to the delicate tones of the bira, from the resonant kora to countless other traditional instruments, African soundscapes were rich and varied. When these instruments found their way into colonial music, they introduced entirely new textures and colors, reshaping the sound of emerging genres. Together, these elements, rhythm, call and response, improvisation, and distinctive instruments, formed the foundation of African music. And as they merged with European traditions during the colonial era, they became the seeds from which new, unforgettable styles of music would grow. When African and European musical traditions met during the colonial period, the result was not merely a collision, it was a profound exchange. Out of hardship, displacement, and resilience emerged something extraordinary: cultural syncretism. As enslaved Africans encountered European settlers, they did not abandon their traditions. Instead, they adapted, blending elements of European styles with their own powerful rhythms, chants, and instruments. This was not a loss of identity, but a reimagining of it, a creative act of survival that allowed African culture to remain alive, even under oppression. In the Americas, this fusion took on unique forms. Imagine African drumming patterns interwoven with European folk melodies, creating entirely new sounds that neither culture had known before. One of the clearest examples can be found in African American spirituals. On the surface, they carried the religious themes of Christianity, but listen closely, and you will hear African call and response structures, rich rhythms, and deep emotional storytelling. These spirituals became more than songs, they were coded messages of hope, resistance, and unity. Across the ocean in Brazil, a different but equally powerful story unfolded. There, the rhythms of Africa merged with Portuguese melodies and traditions. The outcome was samba, a genre alive with energy, syncopation, and soul. Today, samba is more than music, it is the heartbeat of Brazilian culture, celebrated around the world, yet rooted deeply in the history of African resilience and creativity. This process of cultural exchange and syncretism gave rise to hybrid musical forms that carried the complexities of lived experience, songs of suffering, yes, but also songs of joy, identity, and endurance. Through music, African heritage found ways not only to survive colonial rule but to transform and enrich the global soundscape forever. The story of African influence on colonial music cannot be told without looking at how it unfolded differently across regions. Each land carried its own history, its own challenges, and its own cultural mix, and the result was a dazzling variety of musical traditions, each bearing the unmistakable imprint of Africa. Take the Caribbean, for instance. Few places capture this cultural fusion as vividly. Here, the transatlantic slave trade brought together countless African traditions, mixing them with European and indigenous influences. Out of this melting pot, entirely new sounds were born, sounds that would go on to shape not just regional identity, but global music. In Trinidad, calypso became the voice of the people. Rooted in African rhythms and storytelling traditions, it blended seamlessly with European harmonic structures. Calypso was more than just music, it was commentary, a way to speak truth to power, to celebrate, to mourn, and to resist. Meanwhile, in Jamaica, the world would come to know reggae. With its steady backbeat, soulful lyrics, and unmistakable groove, reggae carried the pulse of African drumming at its core. But it was more than rhythm alone. It became a vehicle for messages of justice, unity, and liberation, a soundtrack to the struggles and hopes of its people. And then there is zouk, a genre born in the French Caribbean, where African rhythms once again intertwine with European melodies to create something fresh, vibrant, and distinctly Caribbean. Each of these styles, calypso, reggae, zouk, tells a story of survival and transformation. They are living proof of how African heritage, even under the weight of colonialism, reshaped music and gave the Caribbean its rich, unmistakable soundscape. When we turn our gaze to North America, the story of African influence on music takes on a powerful and transformative shape. Here, on plantations and in small rural communities, enslaved Africans carried with them rhythms, chants, and traditions that would eventually become the foundation of some of the world's most celebrated musical genres. At the heart of this influence lay the call and response tradition, the freedom of improvisation, and the layering of complex rhythms. These elements were more than just musical techniques, they were cultural lifelines. And over time, they gave birth to music that would change the global soundscape forever. Take jazz, for example. Emerging in the early 20th century, jazz was not born in isolation. It was the fusion of African American musical traditions with European harmonic and instrumental structures. Its syncopation, polyrhythms, and spirit of improvisation carried the unmistakable stamp of Africa. Each performance was alive, unpredictable, and deeply personal, a reflection of the creativity and resilience of the African American experience. Then there is the blues. With its haunting melodies, emotive storytelling, and distinctive chord progressions, the blues emerged as a raw expression of struggle, longing, and hope. Beneath its sound lies the soul of African musical practices, reshaped in the context of oppression but never silenced. And gospel, too, tells the story, combining Christian religious themes with African musical structures. With its soaring vocals, rhythmic energy, and communal spirit, gospel became both a form of worship and a powerful expression of identity. Together, jazz, blues, and gospel are not just musical genres. They are legacies, living proof of how African traditions took root in North America, grew, and flourished, ultimately reshaping not only American music but music across the entire world. When we journey into South America, the echoes of Africa resound with unmistakable clarity. Nowhere is this more vivid than in Brazil, a land where the fusion of African rhythms and European melodies gave birth to some of the most celebrated musical genres in the world, samba and later, bossa nova. The African diaspora in Brazil carried with it a deep musical heritage, and despite the hardships of slavery and colonial rule, that heritage remained alive, pulsing through the beat of the drum and the sway of dance. Samba became more than just music, it was a cultural heartbeat, a living celebration of African roots woven into the fabric of Brazilian identity. Listen closely to samba and you'll hear the voice of Africa. Percussion instruments such as the berimbau, with its single-string and ba-like resonance, or the atabaque, with its deep, resonant tones, trace their lineage directly to African traditions. These instruments do more than keep rhythm, they tell stories, invoke spirits, and call communities together, just as they did for generations in Africa. And then came bossa nova, a smoother, more modern evolution, blending the syncopated rhythms of samba with European harmonies and jazz influences. Yet, even in this polished form, the African pulse remained unmistakable, quietly anchoring the music in its ancestral roots. The rich rhythms, improvisation, and communal energy of South American music are living testaments to the enduring legacy of Africa. They remind us that even in foreign lands, under foreign rule, the African spirit did not fade, it adapted, survived, and transformed, gifting the world some of its most beloved and influential sounds. To truly appreciate the depth of African influence on colonial music, it helps to look closely at specific genres that began as local expressions but grew into global movements. Among them, two stand out above all, jazz and reggae. Both are children of African heritage, yet each tells its own story of struggle, creativity, and transformation. At the dawn of the 20th century, in the lively streets of New Orleans, a new sound began to emerge. It was unlike anything the world had ever heard before, a sound born from the fusion of African American traditions with European instruments and harmonic structures. Its heartbeat came directly from Africa, syncopated rhythms, call and response patterns, and above all, improvisation. Jazz was never about simply playing notes on a page. It was about freedom. Each performance carried the spirit of African musical practices, where improvisation allowed musicians to express their deepest emotions in real time. In every trumpet solo, in every swing of the rhythm section, there was a voice speaking, sometimes of joy, sometimes of pain, but always of individuality. As the genre grew, so did its innovators. Louis Armstrong transformed jazz with his bold trumpet and charismatic voice, turning improvisation into pure magic. Duke Ellington elevated the genre with his elegant compositions, weaving together blues, gospel, and classical traditions. Later, Miles Davis pushed jazz into new territories, proving that this music was never static, but always evolving. This constant reinvention is no accident, it is the very essence of jazz. Just as African musical traditions adapted and survived in the face of colonialism, jazz has always embraced change, reflecting the resilience and creativity at its core. Today, jazz is performed on stages across the globe, but its soul remains unmistakably African. It is living proof that music can carry heritage across oceans and centuries, transforming pain into beauty and oppression into art. Now let us turn to another genre, one that carries the heartbeat of Africa in every beat, reggae. Born in Jamaica in the late 1960s, reggae is more than music, it is a voice, a movement, a cultural force. Its foundation lies in African rhythms, most notably the emphasis on the offbeat, that steady pulse that gives reggae its unmistakable sway. This rhythmic heartbeat, inherited from Africa, became the canvas on which powerful stories were painted. Reggae's lyrics were never just casual words. They carried weight, songs about freedom, unity, justice, and resistance. At its core, reggae was a continuation of African oral traditions, where music was not only entertainment, but also storytelling, spiritual guidance, and a rallying cry for change. No figure embodies this better than Bob Marley. With his voice and his guitar, Marley transformed reggae into a global language of hope and resistance. His songs spoke of equality, peace, and African identity, drawing deeply on cultural themes and spiritual traditions that reached far beyond the Caribbean. Reggae's instrumentation also reveals its blended heritage. Traditional African drums like the djem and conga found their place alongside electric guitars, bass, and modern studio techniques. The result was a sound that was at once ancient and modern, rooted in Africa, yet resonating with audiences around the world. From the streets of Kingston to concert halls in Europe, from African villages to American cities, reggae has transcended its birthplace. Today, it remains a global phenomenon, inspiring musicians and movements alike, carrying forward the legacy of African resilience, creativity, and cultural pride. Reggae is proof that music can be both deeply local and universally human, a rhythm that began in Africa, transformed in the Caribbean, and now echoes across the globe. The story of African music is not only one of creation and fusion, it is also a story of survival. Across centuries of colonization, cultural suppression, and the pressures of globalization, African musical traditions faced relentless challenges. And yet, they endured. Not only did they survive, they adapted, carrying their heartbeat across oceans and into new worlds. For enslaved Africans in the Americas, music became a lifeline. In the cotton fields and sugar plantations, spirituals and work songs rose into the air. To an overseer, these might have sounded like simple melodies. But beneath the surface, they carried hidden messages, directions for escape, calls for unity, and whispers of hope. In a world built to silence them, music became their voice. It was resistance disguised as song, solidarity wrapped in rhythm. This ability to preserve tradition, even in the harshest of circumstances, speaks to the resilience and cultural significance of African music. Its rhythms and forms did not disappear under colonial pressure, instead, they adapted, finding new life in unfamiliar lands. And today, the story continues. Across the globe, musicians are rediscovering and celebrating their African roots. From Afrobeat and Afropop to jazz, hip-hop, and electronic fusion, artists weave traditional rhythms, instruments, and themes into modern soundscapes. This is not nostalgia, it is continuity. It is proof that African musical traditions are not relics of the past, but living, evolving expressions of culture. In every drumbeat, in every call and response, we hear both history and renewal. The preservation and adaptation of African music remind us that culture, when rooted in resilience, does not fade. It transforms, and in doing so, it ensures that the spirit of Africa will always echo in the music of the world. As we reach the end of this journey, one truth becomes clear: the influence of African cultures on colonial music is not a simple story, it is a tapestry, rich, layered, and profoundly human. It is the story of how rhythm became resilience, how melody became memory, and how music itself became a bridge between worlds. From the vibrant beats of the Caribbean to the soulful improvisations of jazz, African traditions have not only survived, they have reshaped the sound of entire nations, leaving an indelible imprint on the global musical landscape. Music, in this sense, was never just entertainment. It was a vehicle for cultural exchange, a shield of identity, and a voice of social commentary. It carried the struggles of the oppressed, the spirit of resistance, and the joy of communities who refused to be silenced. And even today, as we celebrate genres born from this fusion: reggae, blues, samba, gospel, jazz, we are reminded that at their core lies the heartbeat of Africa. A heartbeat that continues to echo, inspire, and unite across generations. The resilience, creativity, and enduring legacy of African cultures remind us that music is not only about sound, it is about survival, transformation, and the unbreakable spirit of humanity. And as long as the world sings, Africa's voice will never fade. The story of African cultures and their influence on colonial music is not just history, it is a living tapestry, woven from the threads of tradition, struggle, and artistry. To truly understand this impact, we must step back and see how music became both a bridge and a battlefield, carrying with it the voices of a people determined to survive. When we look across the Americas today, from the blues and jazz halls of New Orleans to the reggae beats of Jamaica, we hear echoes of Africa. We hear rhythms, instruments, and vocal traditions that traveled across oceans, often under the most tragic of circumstances, and yet refused to be silenced. The roots of this story lie in one of the darkest chapters of human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly taken to the Americas. Along with their labor and their suffering, they carried with them their songs, their rhythms, and their instruments. These traditions became their lifeline, a way to remember who they were, to resist dehumanization, and to create something new out of unimaginable loss. During the colonial era, European powers like Spain, Portugal, France, and Britain imposed their authority not only on lands but also on cultures. They often dismissed African music as primitive, unrefined, or unworthy. But music is stubborn, it seeps into the soil, it resonates in the air, and it refuses to vanish. Despite dismissal and suppression, African traditions reshaped the very sound of the colonies. African rhythms, with their pulsing energy and intricate patterns, blended with European instruments and harmonies. The call and response format, a hallmark of African music, gave birth to new ways of singing and storytelling. What began as a survival mechanism for enslaved people soon evolved into a cultural force that would change the world's music forever. In the heart of colonial societies, music was far more than entertainment, it was survival, identity, and resistance. For enslaved Africans, stripped of their freedom and torn from their homelands, music became the invisible thread that bound them together and kept their heritage alive. Picture the fields where enslaved men and women toiled under the burning sun. Their voices rose in song, not just to ease the burden of labor, but to remind one another that they were still human, still connected to a past that no chains could erase. Sometimes, these songs carried hidden meanings, directions for an escape, messages of defiance, or signals for secret gatherings. To the overseers, it was just singing. To those who understood, it was survival. Music also held a sacred role. In places where African spiritual traditions intertwined with Christianity, new forms of worship emerged. Spirituals and hymns carried both sorrow and hope, blending African rhythms with biblical themes, creating a sound that lifted spirits and nurtured faith even in the darkest hours. But beyond survival and spirituality, music was the heartbeat of community. It brought people together, helping them find strength in one another when everything else tried to tear them apart. Through drumming, call and response singing, and dance, enslaved Africans preserved their culture, reminding the world and themselves that their identity could not be erased. In this way, African music in colonial societies was more than sound, it was a declaration: we are still here. We still belong. We will not be silenced. When we talk about the African influence on colonial music, perhaps nothing speaks louder than the instruments and rhythms that traveled across oceans and centuries. Imagine the gem, its deep, resonant voice echoing through a village gathering in West Africa. Picture the kora, with its delicate, harp-like strings, weaving melodies that carried stories of history and tradition. Or the balafon, whose wooden keys created a sound both earthy and uplifting. These instruments did not vanish when Africans were forced into new lands. Instead, their essence lived on, sometimes through adaptation, sometimes through reinvention. In colonial societies, these sounds blended with European instruments, creating something entirely new, a fusion of heritage and circumstance. But perhaps even more powerful than the instruments were the rhythms. African drumming traditions brought polyrhythms, layers of beats, weaving together in intricate patterns that seemed to speak their own language. These rhythms became the heartbeat of enslaved communities, pulsing through work songs, dances, and ceremonies. And because drums were often banned, colonial powers feared their power as tools of communication. Africans found other ways. Hands clapping, feet stomping, bodies moving, and voices rising became instruments in themselves. This body percussion and vocalization carried forward into African American music, leaving an unmistakable mark on genres like jazz, blues, and gospel. What began as survival and adaptation evolved into innovation. The rhythms of Africa, carried in memory and heartbeat, reshaped the soundscape of the colonial world and beyond. Now, let us turn to the human voice, the most powerful instrument of all. In African traditions, the voice was not just a medium for melody, it was a tool of communication, resistance, and unity. One of the most striking techniques was call and response. Picture this: a leader sings a line, and instantly, the group answers back. It's more than music, it's dialogue, community, and connection. This very technique crossed oceans and became the backbone of African American spirituals and work songs. In the cotton fields and plantations, when voices rose in call and response, they carried not only melody but also hope, solidarity, and sometimes even secret messages hidden within the verses. Then there is improvisation, the art of creating in the moment. In African music, no two performances were ever identical. Musicians would weave their own emotions and stories into the fabric of a song, shaping it uniquely every time. When this tradition merged with colonial music, it sparked something extraordinary. It gave birth to genres like jazz and blues, where improvisation became the soul of the sound. Think of a jazz musician, lost in the moment, bending a note, creating something unplanned yet unforgettable. That freedom of expression traces its roots back to African vocal traditions. Through call and response and improvisation, African voices not only endured but transformed the very foundation of colonial music, leaving behind a legacy that still resonates in the music we listen to today. When African and European musical traditions collided, something extraordinary was born: the evolution of entirely new musical forms. These weren't just songs, they were cultural revolutions in sound. Take jazz, for example. Imagine the bustling streets of early 20th century New Orleans, brass bands playing, rhythms pulsing, and voices improvising freely. Jazz was not an accident, it was the direct child of African rhythms, call and response, and improvisation, married to European harmony and instrumentation. It became a living, breathing art form that spoke the language of freedom, creativity, and innovation. Then came the blues, raw, emotional, and deeply human. Born out of the African American experience, the blues carried the weight of hardship but also the strength of resilience. Its famous 12-bar structure and repetitive chord progressions echo the African traditions of storytelling through repetition and variation. Every note, every lyric, told a story of struggle, survival, and hope. But the influence didn't stop there. Across the Americas, African rhythms kept resurfacing, reshaping folk traditions into something entirely new. Think of calypso in Trinidad, reggae in Jamaica, or samba in Brazil. Each of these genres is a vibrant fusion of African instruments, rhythmic energy, and vocal techniques blended with local and European elements. Together, they form a dazzling mosaic of sound, a musical heritage that is still alive, evolving, and influencing global music today. The evolution of these musical forms reminds us of one truth: music is never static. It adapts, it transforms, and most importantly, it carries the heartbeat of the people who create it. When we think of African influence on music, it's easy to imagine the past, the plantations, the slave ships, the colonial courts. But the truth is, this story is far from over. The heartbeat of African music still echoes loudly in the contemporary sounds we listen to today. Take hip-hop, for instance. At its core, hip-hop is storytelling, rhythm-driven narratives that speak truth to power. This is no coincidence. It draws directly from African traditions of oral storytelling and rhythm. Even the use of sampling, where beats and melodies are recycled and transformed, echoes the improvisational spirit of African music. Or look at R&B. Its soulful, emotional expression, the way a singer bends a note, stretches a phrase, or answers a line with a chorus, is rooted in African call and response traditions. Every time you hear a soaring R&B ballad, you're hearing the survival of African vocal heritage. Then there's world music, a genre that thrives on fusion. Here, African drums, melodies, and chants weave seamlessly with instruments and sounds from across the globe, creating new musical landscapes that are as diverse as humanity itself. But perhaps most importantly, the global recognition of African contributions has grown. Musicians, scholars, and cultural leaders now work to preserve, honor, and integrate African musical traditions into modern compositions. They remind us that these rhythms are not relics of the past, they are living, evolving, and shaping the future of music. So when we listen to a hip-hop verse, a soulful R&B track, or a world music collaboration, we are not just enjoying modern art. We are hearing centuries of resilience, adaptation, and creativity. We are hearing the proof that African music did not just survive colonialism, it transformed the entire world of sound. And that is the real legacy, a dynamic, evolving relationship between Africa and the world, one that continues to shape music, culture, and identity today. The colonial period was more than just a clash of empires and economies, it was also a time of profound cultural exchange. And nowhere is this exchange more vivid than in the world of music. The influence of African cultures on colonial music is not a simple story, it's a rich and layered narrative of tradition, adaptation, resistance, and innovation. To truly understand it, we must go back to the roots. The historical context of African music. Before the colonial era, Africa was not one single culture but a vast mosaic of traditions. From the deserts of the Sahara to the forests of West Africa and the coasts of the East, every community carried its own rhythms, instruments, and songs. Music was everywhere, it was ritual, it was celebration, it was communication. It marked births and weddings, honored ancestors, and even reinforced social order. For Africans, music wasn't just entertainment, it was life itself, woven into every thread of communal existence. But with the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, this deep cultural heritage was uprooted and carried across oceans. Millions of Africans were torn from their homelands and forced into the brutal world of the Americas. Yet, even in chains, they carried their music with them, sometimes in memory, sometimes in rhythm, sometimes in the very way they used their voices. Once in the colonies, these African traditions collided with European musical structures and indigenous sounds. Out of this painful fusion emerged something new, musical forms that reflected the complexity of life under colonial rule. The syncopated polyrhythms, the communal call and response, the improvisational spirit, and the unique instruments of Africa began to transform colonial music itself. This was not just adaptation, it was resistance. It was survival. It was innovation in the face of oppression. And it laid the foundation for the genres that would one day captivate the world. To truly grasp the influence of African cultures on colonial music, we need to zoom in on the key musical elements that Africans carried with them across the Atlantic. These weren't just sounds, they were cultural codes, lifelines of identity, and the very heartbeat of new musical worlds. Rhythm. At the core of African music lies rhythm, layered, complex, and alive. Unlike the steady, predictable beats of European traditions, African rhythms thrive on polyrhythms and syncopation. Imagine several drummers playing different patterns at once, weaving a tapestry of sound that feels both grounded and unpredictable. These rhythms became the foundation for entire genres in the Americas: jazz, blues, gospel, and eventually even rock and roll. Without Africa's heartbeat, much of the world's popular music would sound completely different. Call and response. Now, picture this: a leader sings a phrase, and immediately the group answers back. It's not just music, it's conversation, community, participation. This call and response pattern is one of Africa's greatest gifts to the musical world. It carried over into the spirituals sung by enslaved Africans, into gospel choirs, and later into soul and R&B. Even today, when a performer calls out and the crowd roars back, you are witnessing this timeless tradition in action. Instruments. African influence also introduced the world to new instruments with unique voices. The djembe with its deep, resonant tones, the balafon, a wooden xylophone with bright, percussive notes, and the banjo, which traces directly back to African string instruments. These instruments not only expanded the soundscape of colonial music but also transformed how music was played and experienced. Melody and harmony. While African traditions often prioritized rhythm over harmony, their fusion with European styles created something revolutionary. Melodic and harmonic blends emerged, new scales, new tonalities, and new ways of weaving voices together. This meeting of rhythmic power and melodic structure gave rise to music that was both deeply emotional and structurally rich. Together, these elements, rhythm, call and response, instruments, and melody, did more than shape colonial music. They became the DNA of global music, echoes of Africa that still resonate in every beat, chord, and song we hear today. Resistance and survival through music. In the brutal reality of slavery, where voices were silenced and identities stripped away, music became more than just sound, it became survival. For enslaved Africans, songs were not entertainment, they were lifelines. Imagine the fields at dusk. The work is grueling, the overseer's eyes are sharp, but the voices rise anyway. A leader sings a line, and the group answers back. The rhythm keeps the work steady, but underneath the surface lies something far deeper, a code, a message, a reminder of who they are. Music became resistance. Spirituals and work songs carried hidden meanings, lyrics that seemed harmless to the oppressors but spoke volumes to those who understood. A simple line about crossing a river could point to an escape route. A reference to freedom could signal a plan for rebellion. Through melody, enslaved people found a way to speak when speaking was forbidden. But music was also survival. It created a sense of community and belonging in a world designed to break them apart. Spirituals blended African rhythms and call and response patterns with Christian themes, forging a new language of faith, hope, and endurance. The songs were more than hymns, they were a declaration: we are still here. Our voices cannot be erased. This resilience, this ability to turn suffering into song, was one of the most profound legacies of African music during the colonial period. It showed that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could not only endure but sing. Global influence of African music. The story of African music does not end in the plantations of the Americas, it travels across oceans, echoing through continents, reshaping cultures, and leaving an indelible mark on the world. Through the dark chapter of the transatlantic slave trade, African rhythms, chants, and instruments journeyed far from their homeland. What began as forced migration became the seed of a global musical revolution. Wherever Africans set foot, their music took root, transforming, blending, and giving rise to entirely new genres. In Europe, musicians were captivated by the raw energy and intricate rhythms of African traditions. The beats, once carried in the hearts of enslaved people, now began to inspire orchestras, composers, and eventually modern artists. Out of this fascination, genres like Afrobeat and the broader spectrum of world music emerged, celebrations of cultural fusion that continue to thrive today. Picture it: a London jazz club pulsing with syncopated rhythms, a Paris stage alive with African drums, a global music festival where instruments from Lagos meet guitars from New York. Each note tells a story of resilience, migration, and cultural exchange. African music is not confined to one land or one people, it is a global inheritance. From the streets of Havana to the concert halls of Europe, its spirit continues to bridge cultures and generations. Contemporary perspectives on African influence in music. Today, when we listen to the beats of hip-hop, the smooth flow of R&B, or even the layered soundscapes of electronic music, we are hearing echoes of Africa. What began centuries ago as survival, adaptation, and cultural expression during the colonial period has now become a driving force in global music. Scholars, historians, and musicians across the world now recognize what was once overlooked: African music was not just an influence, it was a foundation. Its rhythms, its instruments, its storytelling traditions, all helped shape the soundscape we call modern music. In fact, the renewed interest in African traditions has sparked a cultural revival. Artists and audiences alike are looking back, rediscovering the roots, and reimagining them in bold, innovative ways. Imagine a DJ in New York layering African drum patterns over electronic beats, or a rapper in Lagos weaving ancestral rhythms into his flow. These fusions aren't just experiments, they're celebrations of a heritage that refuses to fade. And so, the legacy of African music is not a chapter in history, it is a living, breathing force. It adapts, it transforms, and it inspires. It reminds us that music is more than entertainment, it is a language of resilience, a bridge between cultures, and a testimony to human creativity. Sparkle's conclusion. The story of African influence on colonial music is, at its heart, a story of endurance and brilliance. Out of struggle came rhythm. Out of oppression came expression. And out of displacement came a powerful cultural exchange that reshaped the world's sound. Even today, every beat, every call and response, every fusion genre is a reminder of Africa's gift to the world, a music that transcends borders, connects generations, and celebrates the beauty of cultural diversity.